Lake Mungo is often regarded as one of the most creepiest and unsettling horror movies out there. In fact, if you look on any horror movie forum, it's one of the most highly regarded and highly recommended horror movies out there. So for that reason, I was naturally very excited to check out this movie because I'm a big horror movie fan, and typically horror doesn't really impress me that much. So when I hear that a movie is, it has a different approach to horror and it's trying to do something unconventional, naturally that leaves me very excited to check it out. And after watching Lake Mungo, I have to say I was very surprised in all the right ways, because not only did I get a very creepy and unsettling and disturbing horror movie, but also got a very deep family drama that tackles themes of guilt, denial, regret, and grief. And I think this movie is excellent when it comes to that aspect. Lake Mungo's approach to horror is very unconventional. It tells its story in a documentary style way, and it creates this very believable and realistic and grounded world. And really, all of the characters within the movie don't really feel like characters. They feel like actual people going through a very, very real thing. And I think that elevates this movie and really does work in the movie's favour. All of the actors within this movie are absolutely fantastic. I've never seen these actors in anything before. In fact, when I searched up these actors, I literally couldn't find anything else they've been in other than this movie, and it generally amazes me because I think every single actor within this movie is genuinely incredible. They feel like real people. They feel like they're going through a real situation, and this movie does that thing, like the actors do that thing that, you often see in documentaries, and that's when someone doesn't want to cry, they kind of hold back their tears and stuff like that. And there's plenty of scenes like that throughout this movie where you can tell that, someone wants to cry about something, but they don't because they don't want to cry on camera in front of people. And when you see stuff like that throughout the movie, it really does add to it because it makes it feel like you're watching a documentary. It doesn't make you feel like you're watching a movie. It feels like every single person within this movie is a real person going through a very real thing rather than a character going through a fictional scenario. I think this movie's approach to storytelling really does elevate the horror aspects because it creates such a believable and grounded world with these characters that don't even really feel like characters, and they feel more like people going through a real life situation, that when the horror does actually happen, it feels so real and so subtle that it just creeps you out. It generally sends chills down your spine. Because this movie does this thing where rather than pointing out what the horror is, and rather than focusing on the whatever the horror thing is, whether it's like, like a ghost or a monster or whatever, obviously in this movie's case it's a ghost movie, it kind of does this subtle thing of just having the horror happen in the background. And there's shots spread throughout this movie that obviously I'm not going to spoil, but there's shots spread throughout this movie where it might not point it out at first and you don't even realize it's there. So when the camera like pans in and zooms in on whatever the horror image is within the frame, it freaks you out because it was there the whole time, but you didn't even realize it. And I think this movie's subtle approach to horror in that regard is really chilling and really creepy and very unnerving. And that's not just down to the subtlety of the horror, but also the sound effects that they use throughout the movie and the way the movie's shot overall. The cameras are very like blurry, so it kind of distorts the image a little bit and it creates this really creepy and unsettling image. And it really does stick in your mind. There's plenty of scenes throughout this movie that are stuck in my mind. There is one scene in this movie towards the end that is easily the scariest scene within the movie. It is so chilling, and it isn't just the image, it's the sound effects, it's the camera, like the camera quality and stuff. It just sent chills down my spine. It was the context of the scene as well, and I don't want to spoil it for you just in case you haven't seen this movie, because even though Lake Mungo is a very, popular movie and a lot of people have seen it, I still think that this is a movie that not enough people have seen, and I still think this is a movie that, is not quite mainstream yet. It's still very much a cult horror movie, and I really do want more people to check this movie out, and that's why I'm trying to avoid spoilers, just in case you haven't seen this movie. I will say, if you haven't seen this movie and you read up online about it and read up about how creepy and unsettling it is, and you go into it expecting a straight up horror movie, you might be a little bit disappointed, because I wouldn't really say this is a straight up horror movie. I would say it's far more of a family drama with horror aspects rather than a straight up horror movie. This movie's approach to horror is very unconventional. It's very outside of the norm to standard horror. It doesn't really make its horror aspects the full focus of the movie. It really does take its time setting up its characters, its story, and really setting up the horror. And the horror is very carefully spread throughout the movie. So I will say that in advance. Don't go into this movie expecting a straight up horror movie, because it really isn't. It really is more of a family drama with horror aspects. And this movie tells its story in a documentary-esque way, but obviously it's a fictional story just told in a documentary style. So in that sense, it's a mockumentary. And I really love that aspect of this movie, because I think it really does add a lot to it. It adds a level of believability to it. It really doesn't feel like you're watching a movie. It feels like you're actually watching a real series of events play out. And I was consistently impressed with this movie's approach to horror and storytelling. It's because of this movie's approach to storytelling and its unconventional approach to the way how it presents its horror that I found it very easy to get invested, because it felt so real. It felt like I was generally listening to real people tell a real story. And it definitely is slow, but it's slow in that good way. It's slow in that sense of, okay, we're taking our time to tell a very believable story, to tell this very dark and very grim story. I will say, outside of this movie's horror elements, it does have a looming sense of dread and tragedy all over it. And I don't just mean, you know, with the death of the daughter. Obviously, the death of the daughter is very tragic, but there's certain reveals throughout this movie that I found to be very tragic. And it really added a further sense of empathy for this family, and this further sense of empathy for what they went through, as well as what the daughter went through before she died. And I think it really does add a lot to the story. It really does add a lot to this movie, and it makes it just more than just a typical horror ghost haunting movie. And overall, I think that this movie was absolutely fantastic. I was consistently impressed with this movie. It's not a movie I absolutely love and adore like some other movies out there, but it is a movie that I was consistently impressed with. I think this is one of the best haunting ghost movies out there. I think it is one of the best horror movies out there, and I think it's a must-watch for horror fans. I'm going to give Lake Mungo an A. I apologise if this review come across as a little bit vague, but I really don't want to spoil this movie for any of you who haven't seen it, because I do think it is definitely worth watching. It's currently streaming on Amazon Prime. If you don't have an Amazon Prime subscription, there is a second sight Blu-ray available for it that you can buy as well. This movie is definitely worth watching, especially if you're a horror fan. I definitely was very impressed by it, and I really hope, if you haven't seen this movie, that you do go and check it out, because it is absolutely worth your time. And it's a real shame that this director has never directed anything else in his life, because I think he is an excellent director, and I think he should really make something else, because I think he created one of the most memorable and one of the most unique horror movies out there, for sure.